This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Kathryn Porter, energy consultant and commentator, for a deep dive on just how much net zero is costing us.
We don't see bills coming down, we see them going up, primarily driven by all of these policy costs. The total cost to consumers is massive.
Why Ed Miliband's claims about renewables are so laughable.
When he's talking about delivering £300 off bills by 2030, that is just completely unachievable.
And how the Green Crusade is putting us at risk of blackouts this winter.
We're relying on very old gas power stations to keep the lights on in low wind conditions in winter when demand is high, particularly if there's low import capacity. Things can get very uncomfortable.
Hello and welcome to The Sceptic. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Net zero is a mess, and it's making us poor. Now, why is that, and what can be done about it? Well, to untangle all that and more, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Kathryn Porter, who is an energy consultant and commentator and the founder of What Logic. Welcome, Kathryn.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, very good to have you here. So plenty to get our teeth into today, but I thought it was probably worth starting with just a little bit about you and your career. So you founded your energy consulting business, What Logic, in 2016. And that's a while before some of these issues really came to prominence politically, and in particular the difficulties with our extremely expensive energy, even though no doubt it had been made more expensive by that point already. And so I suppose how and when did you first realise what a mess we're in with our energy system in Britain?
I suppose it was something of a creeping realisation. So, as you say, I started my business back in 2016. And it sort of started by accident. I didn't actually sit down and think I'm going to be an energy consultant. So you asked about my career. I have a master's degree in physics. I went into finance, initially doing technology stocks in the TMT, in the dot-com boom. So then I lost my job when all that, went badly wrong in 2001. I did an MBA and then I went into a similar role in fixed income, which I actually didn't find that interesting. So I had the chance to move into commodities, and pretty quickly I specialised in energy. And then I just basically alternated between the trading floors of banks and utilities. And when I was at Centrica, I was diagnosed with some health stuff. And I thought I'd take 6 months out to, sort all of that out. And at the same time, I'd been having all of these thoughts about where the market was going. And I just thought, well, I'll start writing a blog. When you're working for someone like Centrica, you're not really that free to express your thoughts on social media. You've got to make it really clear there are your personal views and so on, and lots of people shy away from it. But then I wasn't working for anyone, and I just thought, well, I'll just write this blog and start sort of organising my thoughts about it through that. Then actually people read my blog and decided to hire me to do consulting work. So that's where my consulting business came from. But that was really where it started. Back in 2016, I'd been thinking, well, there's a lot of change going on in the market, particularly on the retail side. I thought the retail market was really not functioning. And around that time, there was all that discussion around the price cap, which I was very against. And I wrote a whole series of blogs saying that, the ultimate sort of conclusion of a price cap is that you can bankrupt your suppliers and end up having to bail them out. And that's exactly what happened in 2021. Our suppliers started going bankrupt and some of them had to get bailed out. We had the special administration regime for bulb, but all of the suppliers, when they went bankrupt, they were effectively bailed out by consumers because the credit balances have to be honoured when a supplier goes bust. So what happens is the supplier of last resort takes that over, and then they get those costs back through a levy that's added onto network charges. So in the end, everybody pays for it. And so I've been thinking about all these different ways that the retail market was broken. And then obviously I could also see that the wholesale market was broken because we've basically removed liquidity from the market. So the government now provides the market hedge for almost all of new generation in the market through the CFD and the capacity market. So it doesn't really leave very much else. And then, of course, on the retail side, you have the price cap driving suppliers into a very regimented hedging strategy. Otherwise, they don't cover their costs. And so what's left? There's then not very many people left to participate in the wholesale market. So we've seen a huge reduction in liquidity, a huge reduction in churn, and a massive shrinkage in the amount of liquidity across the curve. Most people now have to restrict their hedging activities to pretty close to the prompt. So that's also not good for the market. And then I started thinking about other things. I used my blog as a way of organising my thoughts. So when people were talking about hydrogen, my initial physics brain was saying this doesn't sound particularly viable given what I know about hydrogen, but let me look into it. So I did some research and I was like, no, I think my instincts on that were correct. I did a bunch of research into thermal energy storage. I think that has quite a lot of potential if we can identify the right materials. And just generally, it sort of went from there. And the more you sort of start digging into different details, what's happening with network charging, what's happening with connections, what's happening with demand forecasting on the grid and how inertia is managed and so on, you start to uncover that there's a whole mess there that's really, people are not keeping their eye on the ball properly.
And you mentioned your physics background and that giving you an insight there. Do you think that's one reason you're particularly far-sighted on this? I suppose a lot of those analysing these types of things might not even have a background in either physics or finance, but might in fact be in the humanities, for instance. But in fact, you're really across both ends of this very complex system.
So I think that's really true when it comes to policymakers, that there aren't that many of them that have those credentials, if you like. And then you see that reflected in the type of policy they come up with. You look at DESNZ, for example, there's an awful lot of environmental activists working in DESNZ, but they don't have the right credentials. In fact, I would say that it's wrong to hire activists into those types of roles anyway, because they have a very strong bias that's not rooted in data. And this whole thing about data, without having those instincts and that training in critical thinking, you start to go down weird rabbit holes like, oh, renewables are cheap. Yeah, that makes sense because the wind and the sun are free. So yeah, renewables will be really cheap. It's like, no, because the machines you need to take that wind and sun and convert it into electricity, they're not free. They're actually very expensive. And if you're trying to give away your product, which is if the wind and the sun are free, you expect the electricity to be free, and there is a near zero marginal cost, then how are you ever going to cover your capital costs? How will you ever pay for those machines in the first place if you can't get any money selling your product? So, this is a pretty straightforward thinking process, but it seems to be one that's escaped far too many of our policymakers.
So, yes, there's that widely repeated claim, which continues to be repeated all the time by Ed Miliband, that indeed renewables are cheaper, and the more we add renewables to our grid, the cheaper it will be somehow. And indeed, that the only reason we have high electricity prices at the moment is, well, Putin's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. This is a laughable claim, but how come they stick with this?
Well, I think he's backed himself into a corner because gas prices are down now below where they were when Putin made that invasion. So yes, they'd already risen away from their long-term average because of COVID, but he doesn't talk about COVID. He just talks about Putin and Ukraine. So, that's provably wrong. And right, so if we look at the subsidy round last year, AL6, we saw onshore wind and solar priced at around £70 per megawatt hour in 2024 money. And offshore wind priced at £83 a megawatt hour in 2024 money. Now, the average wholesale electricity price, which is around 80% gas and 20% carbon, that was £73 per megawatt hour last year. So the subsidy for offshore wind was 13% higher than the price of electricity generated with gas. Right, so even in the first order level, the subsidy, offshore wind, was 13% more expensive than gas-based electricity. And then Ørsted cancelled Hornsea 4, which was the flagship project from that round, saying that it was not going to be economically viable. So a 13% subsidy over the wholesale price of electricity based on gas is not enough for offshore wind. But of course, consumers don't just pay the subsidy cost. They pay all the other costs as well. They've got to pay for backup because it's not always windy and sunny. Wind and solar have really low energy density. You need 2,000 times more land for wind than you do for nuclear. That's an awful lot of extra wires you've got to use to connect everything up. If you want to build a good-sized gas power station, 800 megawatts, you need a single grid connection. If you want to build that many that amount of energy, 800 megawatts. With wind turbines, you need about 60 turbines. But 60 turbines with a capacity factor of about 35% compared with about 85% for gas. So if you want to get the same amount of electricity over a year, you'd probably need about 150 turbines. So that's 150 sets of wires, more than you would for one gas power station. So there's a lot more network costs going with renewables that consumers pay for. This goes straight onto the bill. Then, because we haven't built enough capacity on the grid, a lot of our wind farms, particularly the ones we're building more recently, can't be used. I mean, Sea Green, we turned it off 2/3 of the time last year. We threw away 2/3 of its output because we couldn't use it. But we still charged consumers for that. That was another few £billion a year. And then the real-time intermittency, where every cloud or every gust of wind impacts your supply and demand balance, that's costing extra billions of pounds a year. So the total cost to consumers is massive. And Miliband and Desnes go, oh no, but the levelized cost of renewables is lower than the levelized cost of blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, nobody cares, right? Because consumers don't pay the levelized cost, they pay the full system cost. It's deeply dishonest to keep banging on about the levelized cost. It's completely irrelevant to the lives of consumers. And so we don't see bills coming down, we see them going up, despite the big falls in gas prices, primarily driven by all of these policy costs. And now he wants to add, the best part of £22 billion onto bills for carbon capture. So this is only going in one direction. And when he's talking about delivering £300 off bills by 2030, that is just completely unachievable unless you cheat and say move subsidies into taxation. I know they're flirting with taking VAT down to zero. That's a 5% reduction. But that's cheating, basically. That's not actually saving consumers money. It's just moving the money around to different places. I mean, I actually think both of those things should be done. I think VAT should be set to zero, and I think the subsidies should be moved to taxation. But that is not the way to deliver on that promise of reducing bills.
Yeah, I mean, that's just playing around with the numbers, right? And of course, there's another disanalogy here with oil and gas. I mean, we've heard this phrase, I think it originally came out of Boris Johnson, that we could become the Saudi Arabia of wind. But of course, there's quite a big difference here in that, yes, these are both ways of producing energy, but you can actually move barrels of oil around and you can export surpluses. Whereas when we have a surplus of renewables, of wind energy, that can often actually be a cost to us. And so it's ridiculous to try and compare the two and to say that we could, the more and more we have renewables, the better and better that will be for our energy costs.
Well, it's also based on another misconception, which is that it's always windy somewhere. And that's just not true. I mean, okay, on a global basis, it might be true, but that's not useful to us. For our intents and purposes, low wind can stretch over large parts of Europe all at the same time and can last for weeks. Just a couple of days ago, day before yesterday, our electricity output, the wind contribution went down to 200 megawatts again. We've got 32 gigawatts installed, and yet we were only producing 200 megawatts for several hours. So, it's just not true. And it reflects, as I said, this deep misunderstanding that people who lack those scientific qualifications have of fairly basic concepts, and they get misled because, they want to believe it. It sounds nice. We'll have this lovely green utopia. But it's just not aligned with the physical reality of the world.
Okay, and so let's move on to politicians and their ability, if not their willingness, to take this on. I mean, so one of the points I think you've made is that we've had this system growing up since about the Climate Change Act 2008, where there's an awful lot of complex subsidies and really vested interests, arguably, in green energy. Does that make it very difficult for politicians who might be minded to take this on? Obviously, Ed Miliband at the moment very much isn't. But for those who would want to hack away at all this, because there's so many incentives against it?
I don't think that's really the thing that's holding it back, to be honest. I think both Reform and the Conservatives are now pretty minded to start unpicking all of this. I think the real challenge is how do you go about doing it? It's pretty straightforward to not do any new subsidies and to not make it worse from this point onwards. But what you do about all the legacy costs, which are already very significant, and they've got different approaches to this, and they're quite difficult challenges. And it's not really driven by vested interests. It's actually more driven by the way these schemes have all been set up and trying to get out of them in a legal way. Now, there's definitely ways you can reduce cost. I mean, there's several levers you can pull with the legacy renewables obligation that would take a fair amount of cost out. Ultimately, you're going to have to do something beyond what's easy to do. So, for example, we've got a pretty established case law around you're not entitled to continue receiving windfall gains. And I think you could argue that both RPI indexation and the fact that some projects receive more than one ROC per megawatt hour, they could both be reasonably categorised as windfall gains and pretty easily removed. But I think going beyond that, and also with the CFD, you're going to need a more significant restructuring. Now, one option is just simply to buy it all and nationalise it and just run it down. That would be very difficult to fund. The other one is to restructure them so that the developers get less money. Now, they're obviously not going to want that, but the government's not entirely powerless here. You can point out that if these people want to operate in the UK going forwards, if they want to participate in the new direction of the energy market, they'd better take a haircut on these legacy subsidies that are really costing consumers a huge amount of money without delivering an awful lot of benefit.
Okay, so if politicians are minded to do something about this, then they certainly could. So what do you make of the present plans towards that from, well, I suppose, Reform and the Conservatives? I mean, it's interesting with the Tories that, of course, it was they who brought this in very heavily, in particular with Theresa May's 2019 amendment to the Climate Change Act, which made net zero mandatory by 2050. And so it's a real screeching U-turn they're having to do now. But do you think that either party is seriously and properly ready to get to grips with this?
I do, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things with the Conservatives was, so first of all, in 2015, everything around 2050 seemed a really long way away. And, you have those discussions around the Climate Change Act. And really the point is, what sort of a psychopath doesn't want to protect the climate? And that's why the debates that were held over that legislation were so lightweight, lacking in substance, and not really addressing the issues, because it all felt too remote to really be real. It felt like a very sort of hypothetical discussion around nice things to do rather than realistic concrete plans. The Conservatives left off. So I think the interesting thing here, and it goes really to the heart of how our governance works in this country. Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. He passed some legislation which made the civil service independent of the government. It meant that ministers can't hire or fire civil servants. So when ministers want a civil servant to do something, and if the civil servant doesn't want to do it, there's not a great deal the minister can do about it. But this change happened not long before the Conservatives came into office in 2010. Over the subsequent 14 years, the civil service essentially became corrupted. And I don't mean that in a brown envelope sense. I mean in the sense that it started to develop a political identity, which was pretty left-wing. And in some departments, they actively went out and recruited environmental activists. So there's a lot of environmental activists working in both DESNZ and DEFRA who are trying to mould policy in line with their own ideals. And that's not compatible necessarily with what the elected government wants. But because ministers can't get rid of these people, they don't really have any ability to control it. Now, this happened gradually over 14 years. When the Conservatives left office, they no longer had access to the civil service. And so whereas in office, when they want information, you just go to your officials and say, give me information about X. Now they had to start finding it for themselves. And they realized pretty quickly that the information that they'd been provided by officials was incomplete and biased, that effectively it didn't reflect the full range of information that they needed for good decision making. And they found that pretty shocking. And quite quickly, actually, after leaving office, they realized that they'd been making an awful lot of these decisions based on incomplete and biased information. And in fact, the other information that they now had access to was more compelling and was leading them to think that they'd got it wrong. And so I think they've been pretty open about admitting that they were wrong. And now they're doing the work to figure out what right looks like. Now, in normal circumstances, you'd say that 4 years out from a general election, they've got plenty of time to figure it all out. But with people talking about an election as early as next year, I think we need to see some acceleration there. And it's going to be interesting whether they use the conference next week as an opportunity to start laying out their stall a little more than they have so far.
And so in terms of the political and electoral wins that the parties are operating within, do you think the public realise how much net zero is costing?
No, I don't think they do. I mean, they can see that their bills are not coming down. I think they're starting to understand that they've been misled. they don't necessarily understand the extent of it. But actually, you're seeing the impacts of job losses. We're seeing a huge, lack of growth in the economy. That's partly driven by high energy costs and partly driven by excess taxation. Unfortunately, this current government seems to have no understanding of what actually drives wealth and drives economic growth. They see business as some other thing that is just a source of tax income rather than as being the engine of the economy. And so I think I think the public's starting to wake up to the fact that it's not going to get better if we carry on, just keep doing the same thing over and over. And I think the bond markets are waking up to this as well, because this, for the past 25, 30 years, we've had this model across the Western world of massively expanding the state, expanding benefits, creating all of these ancillary bodies that are supposedly independent with, full of technocrats who are going to make good decisions based on, the right information and do things in, quote, the right way. And all of this has been debt funded. And those debts are starting to fall due. I mean, the amount of debt we have relative to our GDP is starting to look a bit unsustainable. France is in a much worse state than we are. But added on top of that are huge unfunded pension liabilities at a time we're expecting there to be more retired people than working people in a few years. So we're heading for economic disaster. We're sort of teetering on the edge of it now. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing bond spreads going the way they are. And of course, that increases the cost for the government to borrow money. So this has all got to change now. I think the public only see a small part of this. Most of them are not that au fait with the functioning of the bond markets. But I think they're starting to understand that things are not improving. They've seen a big reduction in their standard of living. And I think this is one of the reasons this whole issue around illegal immigration is proving such a flashpoint. You've got people whose standard of living has fallen. They're less economically secure than they have been historically. They can't access public services. Every time they engage with the state, it's unsatisfactory. They try and get a doctor's appointment. They got to rush to phone up at 8 a.m, and if they're lucky, they get an appointment in 3 weeks. If they want to get a dentist, there's, most people these days can't get an NHS dentist. And then they see people show up here illegally and get all of this stuff immediately. And that just annoys them when they've seen such a big reduction in their standard of living. So I think that we're coming to a point where that established orthodoxy from, the end of the last century is having to change. There's pressure to change. The public might not understand all of the ins and outs of why everything's happening and why their lives are worse than they were previously. But they are noticing and they're not happy.
And so you mentioned potentially caused by that, there may be an early election. And if so, both the Tories and Reform, whatever mix that ends up being, they're going to need to have a pretty fleshed out plan of what they're going to do, in particular to get our energy situation back on track. What would be some key things you'd like to see? I mean, and how are they shaping up so far?
So what I'd like to see is obviously removal of the windfall tax on North Sea oil and gas. I think they're both, the Conservatives and Reform are in agreement on that. But I also want to see that go further and actually put in place tax incentives for more exploration and appraisal activity. We need to actually increase our production in the North Sea, not just extend what we have. And there's a huge economic implication here, because the windfall tax is causing accelerated decline of the basin. And, that is not neutral. The way our tax regime works is that once producers start decommissioning, they get a huge tax rebate from the government. Effectively, while the field is producing, the government takes extra money from the producers in tax and then gives it back to them when they start decommissioning. It's a way of ensuring that the funds for decommissioning are available. And so you can't not do it, because otherwise they might just walk away from their decommissioning obligations and leave that to the state, which would be worse. But the way things are looking now, instead of these net payments starting in late 2030, early 2040s, they're going to be in the early 2030s. So just outside the OBR's five-year budget horizon, the Treasury is going to have to start funding £2 or £3 billion a year in cash out to North Sea producers, because they won't be producing anymore. So there's a massive tax bombshell coming from that. unless we can manage to defer it through increased production. So that would be the first thing that I would do. I would completely restructure the retail market. I would move all of the subsidy levies into taxation. I'd put VAT to zero. I'd get rid of the energy company obligation and the warm home discount and move smart meter rollout to the network operators. So I'd really scale back the retail market to being about delivering gas and electricity rather than all these other social programs. If we want to give people benefits to make their energy more affordable, that should be done through the benefit system, not through bills, where it's basically charged to everyone else. You shouldn't be using electricity bills as a means of wealth redistribution, which is what's happening at the moment. So simplify the retail market. That will immediately lower bills for consumers. Now, obviously, it will increase taxes because some of that stuff has to be paid for, but it will release the retail market to work in a more functioning way. I'd get rid of the price cap as well because it's not really serving any purpose. I think if we want to support people with energy costs, then we could introduce a social tariff funded through taxation. But I think the price cap has to go. There's a lot of research that shows it doesn't really actually deliver the benefits that people think it does. So then we need to tackle the generation side. We urgently need to build new nuclear. So I would abolish the Office for Nuclear Regulation and create a new regulator that sits inside the Department for Energy rather than the Department for Work and Pensions, which is where it sits at the moment. So normally if you abolish a regulator and you create a new one, it's just a rebranding exercise. But in this case, I think we need an entirely new regulator with new people. Don't get the same people from ONR because they've developed a culture of massive risk aversion. It's almost impossible to change an organisational culture to that extent. So I think there needs to be a radical change of personnel. Particularly at the senior levels, maybe more junior people can be ported over. The board of this new regulator should include risk experts from other sectors, such as finance and aviation, to try and keep the nuclear regulators honest, if you like, to stop them from trying to eliminate risk from the nuclear sector, because that's causing premature closure of generation that we really can't afford to lose off the grid. So I'd extend the legacy reactors because otherwise we're going to be in big trouble. And then we need to build new big reactors as soon as possible. I would legislate actually to do that. So bypassing all of the approvals processes, I would basically pass laws that say we're going to build the APR 1400. There needs to be some negotiation with Westinghouse because at the moment KEPCO aren't actually able to sell that in the UK, but I think that can be solved. And I would just legislate we're going to build these at, Wilver, for example, Bradwell, any sites that we can identify. And I'd pay for the first few with public money for construction and then refinance after the construction phase is over, because it's actually construction risk and regulatory risk around that the markets don't like. So I think irrespective of what's happening more broadly with bond yields, I think nuclear-specific bonds with a clear path to refinancing after construction would still go down pretty well in the market. I think they'd get those away pretty easily. Then we need to do something about the gas fleet because that's coming to end of life. We probably need to start building turbines in the UK to be able to supply the turbines that we're going to need. A third of the gas fleet was built in the 90s and is coming to end of life. But right now, if you want to order a new turbine, it's a 7 to 8 year lead time. It's about 5 years for a new rotor. And it's even a year and a half just for the bits and pieces you need for a major maintenance. So we really need to free up those supply chains. And that might mean bringing some manufacturing capability into the UK. So those would be my near-term priorities. Then we also have to look at maintaining legacy electricity and gas grid infrastructure, which has been neglected. And I would just stop building any more renewables. I would just stop subsidizing it. So no more renewable subsidies at all. And if you want to go and build a wind farm or build a solar farm and you can make the economics work, then have at it. But the consumers are not going to, or the taxpayer are not going to be paying for this anymore. I'd do what I could to restructure the legacy stuff to lower the costs, but I absolutely will not do any more.
Well, it sounds like you've got a very worked out plan there. There is one key question I'd like to get your thoughts on, and that's, in January we had this Dunkelflaute for a couple of days, so basically no wind and no sun. And I think we seem to come very close to having blackouts. And we had a lot of emergency power stations having to come online. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed that it was almost just by luck that one particular interconnector from Denmark, it was actually supposed to have maintenance on this day, but then that didn't happen. So we were able to get that little bit of extra power, and that saved us from a blackout. So I suppose remind us of that episode, but are we still in danger of that particularly worrying possibility of blackouts this winter or in future because of our reliance on renewables?
Yeah, we are. And, it irritates me that NESO is trying to gaslight people to say that this was no big deal and it was all fine. Well, yes, it was all fine on the day, but that was more by luck than judgment. That interconnector from Denmark actually came back early from maintenance. And NESO basically just wrote a blank check to the Danish grid operator to do that. They didn't actually know the cost of it for weeks and weeks and weeks later. Now, as it turned out, it wasn't that expensive. But they literally said, we've got to have it. Don't care how much it costs. And so that's a real indicator that the market was not so comfortable the way they were telling everyone. If you've got 3.5 gigawatts of spare capacity, which is what they claimed, you don't write blank checks to other system operators to bail you out. So their position just doesn't bear scrutiny. They seem to have misunderstood how their own reserve works. And in their own winter outlook, it says, that period in the beginning of January is vulnerable because lots of interconnectors tend to still be on maintenance. You can have low wind conditions, but everyone's gone back to work, and so demand is quite high. And in a cold snap, which is what we had cold weather and we had low wind. But the wind wasn't even that low. It was about 2.5 gigawatts. The other big problem was that NESO is very bad at demand forecasting. A couple of weeks after this incident, they decided they were going to audit the way they forecast demand. And they admitted they hadn't looked at it in, quote, 10 to 20 years. Now, 20 years pretty much takes you back to NETA, which is the start of our current market structure. And if you read the grid code, it pretty much reads as if it hasn't been looked at for that long. So NESO's really dropped the ball here. And of course, they like to pretend, nothing to see here. It's all good. They've just put out a report saying the Iberian situation couldn't happen here. Again, that's just not true. A big problem in Iberia was lack of grid code compliance of all sorts of assets on the grid, very high levels of non-compliance with renewables, but also some non-compliance with conventional generation. We don't monitor grid code compliance here. So there's no way they can say with confidence that those issues don't exist in Britain. So yes, our grid is vulnerable. It's increasingly vulnerable. We're relying on very old gas power stations to keep the lights on. In low wind conditions in winter when demand is high, particularly if there's low import capacity, things can get very uncomfortable. And then you're really hoping that nothing breaks and that NESO has forecast its demand correctly. And so it's scheduled everything. It made some really dumb decisions on the 8th of January. It took out a big gas power station, Rye House, out of the market because it thought it was too expensive and ran its reserve hydro at full load through the peak. That meant that if something had tripped off, you didn't have anything other than a few batteries, and not all of them were fully charged, to provide you with that instant response. And normally you'd get your batteries to respond instantly. 16 seconds later, you'd get your big hydro plant up. But if the hydro is already running, then what do? They were going to have to wait 15 minutes to be able to ramp up some of their gas power stations that were running at half load and could go to full load. But that takes 15 minutes. And they didn't have it. They didn't only get the demand forecast wrong in terms of the quantity, they got the timing wrong as well. And so the issue isn't just how much generation do you have in your pocket, it's how fast can you activate it, how quickly can you get that actually delivering. And gas power stations with the best will in the world, they're not instant response. If your gas power station is off, like Rye House was at 0 at 5:15 on the 8th of January, the peak happened 6 minutes later, that's not going to get back up to full load, it's going to take 25 minutes. And so by then you've missed the peak, it can maybe get you a little bit in that time. They might not even be able to synchronize in that time, actually, because you've got to get up to a certain speed with your turbines before you can do that. So it's, them saying it was all fine was just not true.
And what was it about the demand that they had failed to forecast for not having looked at it for so long? Was there something unusual there, or had they just not been paying attention?
Okay, so the way the grid works is that we need to keep what we call frequency in very tight bands. So that's just the rate at which current and voltage change in an alternating current grid. And electrical equipment is super sensitive to this. If frequency goes outside its operating parameters, and NESO has a statutory duty to keep it within 1% of 50 hertz, and that's so 50 cycles per second. And because if it doesn't, then equipment has protection mechanisms, it'll just turn itself off. So generators, substations, transformers, all this stuff, they'll just disconnect because they don't want to break, which is what would happen if the frequency went out. Now, the frequency is connected with the amount of supply and demand at any one time. So if you have more demand than you have supply, the frequency falls. So if you get that forecast wrong, if your demand is higher than you expected, then your frequency can drop. Now, if you don't have more generation available to turn on, or you can't turn it on fast enough, then you can't respond to that increase in demand with a corresponding increase in generation, and then the frequency can fall. And if that error is big enough, then the frequency will fall outside operational tolerances and things will start turning themselves off. So that's ultimately what happened in Iberia. The thing that crashed the grid in the end, the last thing that caused it to happen, was a drop in frequency. And then, of course, as soon as things start disconnecting, that makes it worse because some power stations disconnect, so that lowers the frequency even more. So then some more power stations disconnect and it just cascades, which is what happened in Iberia. Now, obviously, the cause of why that frequency was falling in the first place was different. But once you get into that zone of frequency falling, and you can't stabilize it by introducing more generation, then really all you can do is either disconnect demand, and so that's called demand control. They would just say turn off a whole region of the country to try and protect the grid. But those are decisions you've got to make split second, because the Iberian grid collapsed within seconds. Once it started, that was it. So then you're relying on people in the control room realizing what's going on and then taking the correct actions to solve it. And if your forecasting tools are not very good, then that's going to really hamper you in doing that. I don't think they do. I don't think they do scenario testing here either. So really, you'd want your shift operators to be doing simulations on this, where they simulate what would happen if we got our demand forecast wrong and our wind forecast wrong, because that was also wrong that day. Wind was a bit lower than they expected. Demand was higher than expected. Very quickly, it can go wrong. And NESO's demand forecast, they publish the error over a half-hour period from the day ahead, and the average error is 600 megawatts. But the biggest error over 4 years was 4.7 gigawatts. So that's 3 times the single largest in-feed loss, which is the amount that defines how much reserve they hold. So basically, their half-hourly error can be 3 times bigger than the amount of reserve they hold. So you'd better hope that that error doesn't happen on a day when it's tight.
And that will be enormously consequential for hospitals, for instance, losing power potentially and things like that.
Well, 11 people died in Iberia, and that was really benign weather. So if we had that happen in Britain in the winter, it would be terrible. More people would die. And in Iberia, they had the army out supplying diesel to the hospitals to make sure that the hospitals were stocked enough with diesel to keep their generators running. And then they had the police out on the streets, because obviously you had no traffic lights. So they were trying to do traffic control in part to make sure the military vehicles could get through to the hospitals with the fuel supplies. So
one question that we're always very interested in here is, well, what's going on in the heads of the climate zealots? And that can always be a difficult one, of course. But you mentioned that Ed Miliband keeps banging on about this totally false stat that actually renewables are cheaper. But I suppose, do you think he's just a pure ideologue here? I mean, or does he just not know? Or what is behind that? And I suppose, what would it take for him to change tack?
So all I can really answer is to sort of remind people of the Spanish Inquisition. It's when people are so enmeshed in ideology, they abandon rational thinking. And I think we're at a stage now with some climate zealots that this really is a religion. They talk about deniers. They're the new heretics that should get burned at the stake, obviously using environmentally sustainable fuel. And so how do you change that? It's almost impossible. He doesn't seem to look at evidence. Now, when you ask Miliband, and I've seen him in interviews, people ask him about this, they challenge him, he always comes back to, the climate emergency, and that finger jabbing thing that he does, the climate emergency. Now, Miliband's net zero policies, by his standards, are making the climate emergency worse. Makes energy expensive. That causes offshoring of manufacturing from Britain to places with dirtier energy, China primarily, other places in East Asia. Then the goods that we previously made here have to be shipped here. Obviously, that creates emissions as well. So although our territorial production emissions fall, global emissions go up. Now, if he's genuinely motivated by preventing the climate emergency, then enacting policies that make it worse by increasing global emissions make no sense. So his policies lack any sort of internal coherence. And this is what really annoys me about it. He gets all passionate about the climate emergency and how we have to act urgently to save the climate. But he's not saving the climate. All he's doing is making British people poorer, making their energy less secure, and at the same time, making the climate situation that he claims to care about worse. This is completely irrational. And so, if he genuinely thought there was a climate emergency that needed dealing with, then he'd be acting to reduce overall emissions, not just territorial emissions. And he's not doing that. I can't answer the question of why. It doesn't make any sense. All I can think is he's so enmeshed in this thinking that he can't see his way out. And it's either hubris that he doesn't want to admit he's wrong, or he can't see that he's wrong. But either way, this isn't somebody you want in a senior position in government. If you can't accept you're wrong when there's overwhelming evidence that says so, then you're just not an appropriate person to be having that sort of a role.
Okay, and so, as you said, even from the perspective of what we might call the climate alarmist narrative, what Ed Miliband is doing is wrong. But anyone can see how costly it is and how crippling it is being to our energy security and business and everything else. But I am interested, finally, in what your take is on the whole, climate change alarmist narrative, as many people see it, and so the science behind it. How skeptical or otherwise are you of that broadly?
Okay, so I'm not a climate scientist, and they're not really waters I want to wade into. I look at the impact of the policies that are arising out of that. Now, what I do think is that given the cost, the very high cost of attempting this energy transition, which, as Chris Wright points out, has been an abject failure so far. We spent trillions of dollars globally and made almost no impact on the actual energy mix that's used globally. There's something like a 3% change or something. And actually, if you dig into it, it's pretty interesting that it really appears that renewables are displacing the use of wood rather than displacing the use of fossil fuels. But anyway, so I think it's perfectly legitimate for people to question this, and those with the appropriate credentials in climate science to do that, to ask those questions about, does all that stuff add up? Does it make sense? Is the orthodoxy reflecting the evidence, which, isn't necessarily the case. People, we saw in COVID, for example, how quickly people changed their minds about things. In 2020, if you said that COVID originated with a lab leak, you were dismissed as a swivel-eyed loon conspiracy theorist. But now that seems to be pretty accepted. So I think that it's legitimate for these things to be questioned and challenged, given the very high cost. But my interest lies more in, if you say that you have these objectives, A, are your policies to deliver those objectives rational? And B, are they actually sensible? Because even if we restructured the policies and did manage to lower overall emissions associated with the UK, not just our territorial emissions, the UK only contributes about 0.8% to global carbon dioxide emissions. So is it then cost effective for us to be damaging our economy to the extent that we are? So I think those are really the kinds of questions that I prefer to focus on. Indeed.
Well, thank you for providing such coherent and rational answers to them. Kathryn Porter, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of The Sceptic. Thanks for watching, and see you again next week.